Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond Talking Points. This is Matt, and of course, I'm with my co-host Matt. So today we're going to touch on a few things, but we're going to start by talking about the third Jordan Peterson-Sam Harris debate. This one was also featured Douglas Murray, who gave his thoughts here and there. And after watching, 4 hours of Harris and Peterson debate already to lead into this, we've kind of covered a lot of the general themes and where they generally disagree. And I think we've had a lot of conversations about how we feel about those kind of broad themes. So I think how we're going to tackle this debate and how we might end up tackling the fourth debate when we get around to that is we're going to kind of give observations of moments that kind of stood out to us during their conversation and kind of give our commentary on that. So it's less going to be us probably grilling each other on first principles and more of us saying, here's a specific argument that a person might have made, or here's how we're seeing this difference, and maybe giving some thoughts. So it might be a lot more brief commentary on several different parts. And if we have time, we're planning on discussing in general the Black Lives Matter movement and everything going on with the coronavirus right now. But it's a little ambitious to cover all three of those things in close to an hour, so we might end up having to cut off at some point there. So to lead in on the Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris debate, I took significantly, as I mentioned to you, I took significantly less notes on this one. But there still were a few things that stood out to me, or they at least made me want to hear your take on them. So somewhat early on into the discussion, one of the few times Douglas Murray actually got the opportunity to say something, as he was often kind of blocked out of the conversation. So Murray made the claim that like our Western society and order likely stems from Christianity, and Christianity being the basis of the culture. And I'm glad he mentioned that, because in the Jordan Peterson Sam Harris debate, they kind of talk a lot more about extracting values, and they don't really talk about Western culture versus everybody else. But Douglas Murray on stage, being a kind of right-wing person, is willing to just bring up this basic contention that the people over at like Daily Wire will bring up all the time. And it's kind of them saying that the reason why our Western civilization is the way it is because of, Judeo-Christian values. And Murray was essentially echoing that thought. Now, in my mind, I don't think it's a completely wrong point to make. And I feel like that's where you and I might differ. And I'm mostly giving my intuition on this point. But one of the things that I think is a perk of Judeo-Christian values is even if it's based on dogma, it gives you something, very high above to easily anchor your intuitions to. So even though I kind of lean towards the idea that a lot of our morality is based on our intuitions, in a widespread cultural way, it's made it easier to anchor these values, or very basic suppositions. And if you posit that there is a God, it's more convincing if you convince everybody to agree. And that's what Western culture did for hundreds of years generally. But they, obviously allow exceptions for a bunch of atrocities. But I guess my point is, I think that's somewhat true because it helped the ideas maybe gain movement or spread. But I kind of think it misses the point, right? It doesn't mean we still need religion to still keep those values. I think that's kind of where I'm at when I hear that argument. So do you want to kind of chime in on that?
As I was telling you before we started recording, I must have missed that part of the debate, or I just forgot about it. But I'm more than happy to respond to it now that I know what Douglas Murray said. And I think that what we consider Western civilization, a big term, it does stem from two, you would almost say mutually exclusive trains of thought. So you have, well, two or three, depending on how you score it. But, and I've said this, I think, on a previous podcast. So there is the influence of culture from the ancient Greeks. There is influence on our culture from the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. And then there is our Judeo-Christian influence. And I really don't. There really is nothing to argue with. I mean, in that sense, I mean, there is both strains exist, and it would be silly to simplify it and just say no, we're just a Judeo-Christian culture, or no, we're just a Greek/Roman culture. And a lot of but now, of course, I would say that also that a lot of the progress we have made has come from the fact that you think about the Renaissance. This is going to be a slightly historical point, but I think it's important. What was the Renaissance? The Renaissance was a rebirth of, or I think it literally means rebirth. It was a time when, for a while, Western civilization kind of lost our Greek-Roman heritage, lost the access to the texts. People no longer read Greek and Latin. And then around the time of the Enlightenment is when people started to look at those texts, found them again, actually thanks to the Muslim world, and started to learn Greek and Latin again, started to examine the text, started to think about the arguments that these Roman and Greek philosophers were making, and they were trying to square away how do we accept this truth while not denying the truth of Jesus Christ? And of course, then we have the scientific revolution and then the Enlightenment. And I think it's pretty clear that our society begins to get far better when the Enlightenment rolls around. Now, of course, there were the atrocities in the 20th century. And then after that, it gets even better in terms of the living standards, in terms of things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, more education, more people just knowing how to read and write and do arithmetic. And so I think that I would say that I am still firmly more in the line with one tradition rather than the other, and I think that one tradition serves us far better than the other tradition. But I don't disagree that there are different strains within Western civilization, and we have to contend with all of them.
Now, as you said all of that, it made me have a thought, and this is a very potentially stupid thing to say or to think. I don't know if I've heard anybody make the argument, and maybe it's because it might not be a good point or worth pursuing. So maybe I'll give this thought, and then you can respond to it or move on to the next the thing you want to touch on the debate. But I had the thought that maybe the backdrop, to talking about what it's the religious roots versus the Enlightenment versus certain parts of the Renaissance. I don't want to completely discount it and say none of it matters, but a lot of society's progress is almost kind of the natural outgrowth of people participating in repetitive games and then refining things, right? That's kind of like how a lot of the things in business and markets improve, is because then a competitor enters the market and they either have to figure out how to change their product to make it better, or they have to figure out how to drive prices down. And I wonder how much we can actually chalk up to kinds of theories of thoughts that are almost academic oriented, and how much like those the shifts in culture that those things changed really led to growth, instead of just thinking, well, maybe it's just people in the best position in society, which is generally historically it was like the Western areas, right? Europeans were in a better condition than say Africa. So if you imagine those people who are having prosperity already and they're ahead, and then they get to engage in repeated games to improve resources, I wonder how much was kind of inherently going to happen. And then we see big scale things based on philosophy happen all the time. Like if you think of the French Revolution, right? You can't really chalk that up to maybe you could chalk that up to repeated games going wrong though. So I'm not sure. This is just a thought I had. How much do these huge philosophical backdrops that are in every historical text really matter in terms of shaping things when a lot of these things are academic and then oriented? But that's just me spitballing because I had that thought cross my mind and I felt the need to share it. I don't know if there's any validity to that train of thought. You're still muted.
I guess I'll go on to one of my first points. I don't really have much to say to that thought you just had. And it has to do with Peterson and Harris's the fact that they have very different philosophical foundations. And I think I'm right in characterizing them. And not that they would be listening to this podcast, but if they did and they were like, Matthew mischaracterized me, you can let us know. So Sam Harris is, I think, what they call a philosophical realist, meaning he believes that there is a reality out there that exists apart from our senses, apart from our interpretations, apart from conscious beings. Whereas Jordan Peterson, I think, has called himself a pragmatist, and of course, pragmatists tend to believe that things are true if they are useful. But Peterson even, you could say, takes this a step further, because I remember in one of the lectures I saw him, one of the lectures of his I saw, he said, "We don't know if the universe could exist without conscious beings." So in other words, in some sense, the universe is a extension of our mind. And I suspect that has to do, this core philosophical difference, I suppose you would say epistemological difference, really goes to, it really explains why they disagree about religion, because Jordan Peterson would say that religion is useful, so in that sense it's true. And then of course Sam Harris would draw the distinction, no, just because something's useful doesn't mean it's true. And I consider myself a philosophical realist. And I would probably go so far as to say that I believe in what is called the correspondence theory of truth, but that's a slightly different topic for another day. I just, at that point, when I saw that part of a lecture of Jordan Peterson, I realized, I suppose, what's part of my issue is with Jordan Peterson himself, which is he borders on woo-woo. He's bringing an academic respectability to his opinions, but I think sometimes his opinions go so far that I just don't. I might be able to understand why he comes to those positions, but I could not myself come to those positions, just because I guess you could say my epistemological foundations are very different from his. I mean, the idea that the universe would not exist without us, I just don't quite follow, unless you correspond, or unless you believe in the idea, maybe that there's some consciousness to the universe. But I really don't see any evidence that the universe has any consciousness. As far as I know, animals have consciousness. We have consciousness. Probably birds and other mammals and have consciousness. So yeah.
I really like that point. I might go on a bit of a meta point based on that. I think a lot of what I find so appealing about Jordan Peterson. Well, I guess I should take that back 2 steps. One thing I found is, even if I consume enough of a person's content, I may not agree with them even a lot, but there will be certain things I agree with them on, or I find fascinating, to where that's enough for me, right? So they can become a compelling figure for certain reasons. And one thing about Jordan Peterson, which I think is what makes him so polarizing, is he kind of goes out of his way. He talks in a very dramatic way, but I don't think he's doing it by design, and I don't think he's being anti-intellectual. But he's almost trying to make a point that shows that if you're being overly academic, you're missing the point. And he'll say things that will absolutely trigger people who are like new atheists, because he'll say things like that Adam and Eve isn't just a story, it's quite possibly like the most true thing that you could possibly believe. Or, well, not, you wouldn't even say believe, you could say it's the most true thing because of all the things that this symbolizes and how core this is to humanity existing in and of itself. And then you're sitting there, well, Adam and Eve, I'm not sure that they existed or were the first two humans. How can you say that's the most true thing? But it's because Jordan Peterson goes out of his way to communicate his points in a very specific way that is dramatized, because he's not really saying that what matters is the story. He's saying that these stories represent so many different facts from them that it's incredible, and it pretty much defines human nature and things that characterize everybody's life, even to this day. So although I think your epistemological analysis, I think that's probably correct, because I could see Jordan Peterson saying that, but maybe he wouldn't mean it in as much of like a literal way, which is kind of what makes it confusing, because even though he comes from an academic background, he isn't trying to say things in a way that would be interpreted literally by an academic, because an academic is going to approach language in a much more narrow technical way than Jordan Peterson would. So he would say, well, maybe the universe doesn't exist without us because we're like essentially the supreme creatures of the universe as far as we know to this point. But if you can't have people to interact with the environment with a complex, brain to analyze and perceive facts, then the universe isn't really the universe. It's missing something that characterizes the universe as itself. If it's just a bunch of atoms that are just doing things without consciousness, then is it really the universe, or should he use a different term almost? He's probably not saying literally the universe wouldn't exist. He's probably saying a core important feature of the universe might be the fact that there are people with consciousness interacting with it, right? So then you could still say, well, then the universe and the planets would still be there, and he might not even disagree with that, but he'd be saying this is a core tenet that exists in the universe. And see, you can shake your head, and I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm not even agreeing with Jordan Peterson. That's just how he talks, right? So it's easy to maybe extrapolate things that are literally incorrect about what he's saying, but that kind of misses the point, And that's why I think he ends up being polarizing, but I think that's why so many people love him, is he talks in this way that is so dramatized that it's more communicable, because he says it in this very dramatic way, everything. Even when he's talking about the Bible, even though he's not even preaching you to believe in it. He's just saying how important the ideas are, and he's very dramatic about it. So I could see why that, part of the debate where he talks like that and you end up analyzing it in a certain way could set you off. And you're like, well, here's where I drastically depart from him, right?
Do you want to go on to another point, or should I respond?
I don't want us to get bogged down too much, but I kind of think I said all I could say on that point, so I'm ready to move on.
Could I just add one thing then?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, I just wanted to add that I think that would be, if that's his interpretation of the universe, I just think that's a very it's a interpretation of the universe which is very human centered. It's saying that the whole point of basically what you said, the whole point of universes, which you said Peterson probably might say, is the whole point of universes is to have consciousness. But the fact that consciousness seems to be such a such a uncommon phenomenon, because as far as we know, life on Earth, or life in the universe is barren. But life at this point, all we know is life on Earth. That's all we know. I mean, there must be life elsewhere in the universe, but we just don't know where it is. There's no evidence for life elsewhere. So I just think, I think that's if you take that to be a scientific statement, I think that's a false statement. But you can move on now.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to say he would say that's the defining characteristic. I would just say it's one of the defining characteristics. I think it would overlap similarly with, I know we didn't get to touch on it 2 debates ago, but it was the end of their first debate when Jordan Peterson kind of described the vague idea of a God he would say he believes in. and then like he says something that people wouldn't really describe as God. I could see him very easily doing something similar in terms of how he defines his words and chooses his words to the universe. And then given that definition, it would imply that there need to be something with consciousness to interpret it, or else it doesn't have the same validity because it's just a bunch of empty space with with nothing conscious interacting with it. So he would say that there's a difference between those two spaces. Now,
I just disagree with that.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm not saying I even agree with it. I don't think I'm just saying that's the kind of person he is and how he communicates and phrases things, and he has this very unique lens that's compelling. I think that's why part of why it's popular. I'm going to take a completely different route because I had a couple other observations that were less philosophical. So at one point, they end up talking about extremists and politics. And I thought Jordan Peterson did bring up this interesting idea about how you have the right-wing extremists, and it's really easy to box them together and figure out when they've gone too far. Because all of a sudden, they'll get, too over the top about nationalism. They'll get too over the top about racial identity. It's like, oh, somebody's a Nazi, put them in a box. That guy's clearly a radical right-wing extremist. But then people on the left, it's a lot less obvious given because a lot of the people who want government to take over more things, it's just kind of like they took the next step on the continuum. Well, where do you draw this line of, okay, well, now it's an extremist, and why is this the case? I thought that was kind of fascinating. I think there are certain boxes you could definitely check off what makes a left-wing extremist a left-wing extremist. Like, I think you would probably agree with not believing in freedom of speech would probably be an easy way to box the left-wing extremists, maybe. And then I would probably say something about, because the reason why I'm kind of skeptical of anarcho-communism is because of the concept of, well, if you want everybody to be a community, but if somebody sits out, you kind of have to throw them in a gulag. So I'd say something related to participation having to be a certain way, and if you stray from it, that's like criminal. But that's also endemic to really any state. So I don't know if that would really work as a box. So did you have any thoughts on that kind of part of their discussion?
I mean, I think you can make the argument, and I would probably agree that more people, let me put it this way, more people on the right get called Nazis than people on the left get called Stalinists. So in other words, in some ways, this culture we have is hypersensitive to the extreme right, and perhaps it's not as visceral. It kind of goes back to the debate: who was worse, Stalin or Hitler? And there really seems to be there's a book by the novelist Martin Amis called Koba the Dread. Koba was one of Stalin's nicknames, and the Dread, the Terrible, etc. And he makes the argument. I don't remember like the exact quote, but he makes the argument that there's something visceral about Nazism. There's something, and I think he even draws the distinction between crying and laughter. In that maybe you'd be more likely to cry about the German history of Nazism, and maybe laugh more about the history of Stalinism in the Soviet Union. There just seems to be something visceral, viscerally. There seems to be something that just almost makes people feel physically ill when they think about Nazism. And whereas Stalinism, it's a bit more distant, you could say. It doesn't feel as bad. Now, I'm not saying it is or is not as bad, but that seems to be the general tenor of people's feelings, whether they're right or wrong. But I guess what I would say is I don't think, and I think this is probably where Peterson and I disagree, and maybe even you and I disagree. I don't think that these radical leftists or these SJWs or whatever you want to call them, I really don't think they have as much power as, say, someone like Jordan Peterson or maybe Douglas Murray thinks they do. I really think that most people, look at these people on the far left who, do cringy things, and they look, that person's cringy. I'm going to go over here now and leave them alone. And then someone could say, well, what about the academy? It's like, yeah, people in the academy are more left wing. That's definitely true. But if you really, I'm just not sure that people, that even if, okay, let's just imagine, I don't know, 25% of professors are Marxists, say. I'm not, we don't have the numbers on that. There might not be a way to have the numbers on that, but even let's just imagine it's 25%. I don't, do you really think, or does someone really think those 25% of those Marxist professors that make up 25% of the horror professors around the country, or do you really think they have that much sway or that much influence? I really don't. And I think it's a sign, in some sense, all this political correctness and whatnot. It's a sign of the left's failure to fully understand a lot of the modern issues, and quite often people end up using arcane language and that maybe was relevant in Marx's time, but might not be relevant today. So I guess that would be my caveat to what you just said.
Yeah, I think I would definitely agree that there's people are not good at drawing distinctions between a lot of far left terms. So, like to most people, all the phrases like Stalinist, communist, socialist, and like anything about Marx or Lenin, all those things are kind of like one amalgamous blob that mean the same thing. And if somebody seems further left than most of the Democrats, then you'd assume, if you're like more of a somewhat politically involved person, that any of those terms could apply to them, right? And a Marxist is very distinct from the neoliberal power in government. And now I think, how should I describe this? I'm pretty confident. I feel like the people with the most power is, I wouldn't even say center left, because I don't really think, well, I think the center is left wing inherently. I even think center right is pretty left wing, because I conflate left wing ideas with government, right? I think the best way for us to proceed in the conversation is to not use the terms left and right, and we should just talk about statism. But as people would think of like the neoliberal financial kind of and globalization and things like that, I think that that's really just statism growing on a worldwide level. I think that's pretty much the dominating theory right now, and nobody's challenging it. Because people who are on the center right aren't trying to shrink the state, and nobody on the left in government is trying to shrink the state. Now, I know we're going to try to talk about Black Lives Matter later, and a lot of their ideas sound very radical, but I guess I mostly want to touch on that later. But when we talk about ideas like economic injustice and stuff like this, these are things that the globalized, big government wants to handle. These are things they want to tackle because then they can handle it in their cronyist ways. And that's how they've been handling it for decades and decades. And I'm sure there are people on the spectrum with with no power who are off in the corner, the real radical leftists, some could say, the people who are actually Marxist, they wouldn't disagree. They would disagree with that agenda. And those people don't have power. But a lot of the academics that are oriented towards things like economic injustice, I think those people are like pretty similar to the people in power right now. Now, the problem is, I think their agenda is it's almost not as obviously overt in that way. Like a lot of people who are center right are still in favor of the state, think the state should do things. Like Jordan Peterson would fall in that center right area, and he's not trying to, he's not rallying against healthcare in Canada being provided by the government. He's not rallying against a lot of things. He's not shrinking the state, and I think he indirectly, to some extent, isn't really fighting against a lot of the causes. Now, I think you're going to disagree with that analysis, but I feel very confident in that. So, but yeah, you can chime in, and then I'll let you get the last word too, and then we can move on to the next topic, so we don't dwell on that for too long, because I think it'll come back up when we get to tackle Black Lives Matter.
I think I would put it to you like this. So, when you think about the most left wing of the Democratic Party, so people like Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, my favorite people. That's me trying to trigger you, by the way. Those are, and I might have touched on this before, so I apologize if I'm repeating myself, but those are social democrats. Those are people who want regulated capitalism. They want a welfare state. They want a society in which the government takes care of people if necessary. But they don't want the abolishment of capitalism. They don't want a dictatorship of the proletariat. They don't want all these kinds of things that are truly far left. And then you have people like Joe Biden or Bill Clinton or Barack Obama. And I think it's absurd to think that someone like Barack Obama, say, really believes in economic inequality, because he did absolutely nothing to diminish the gap between the richest person and the richest people and the poorest people. In fact, what do those three men have in common? They are all puppets of big business. They are all puppets of the ultra wealthy. And so I just don't. I just disagree, I guess, that the politically correct leftists and neoliberal leftists really have a lot in common. Someone like Hillary Clinton might pay lip service to the politically correct leftists just because she's deeply out of touch with what people really care about, and she was trying to squeeze out every single vote she could. But no, I don't think. I agree with you that it really is neoliberalism that is predominating, but I don't think. I'm not sure I would even go so far as to say that's left wing. But I'll leave it at that. We can maybe have another discussion at a later date about the intricacies of neoliberalism. Go ahead.
Oh, it was actually your turn to pick a topic, and I was.
Oh, it's my turn.
Yeah, we're letting that. We're gonna set that one aside.
Okay. I guess I would like to talk about. Well, I don't know. My list is so crazy. I guess I will talk about. I'll talk about the thing that I said triggered me. Which is it was someone who was on the BBC. This was Douglas Murray. What Douglas Murray was saying. He said he saw some woman on the BBC, and I guess the BBC commentator was asking, why do you defend Barack Obama? And the woman said, no, why would I defend Barack Obama? I'm a bloody communist or something like that. And so Douglas Murray was trying to make the point that, I don't understand how someone in the 21st century could call themselves a communist due to the Gulag, due to the horrors of Stalinism, due to the horrors in China and in Cuba. How can you be a reasonable person? How can you have a good conscience and believe and be a communist after all of these horrible things have happened in the name of communism? And this triggered me, of course, because I consider myself a radical leftist of sorts. I can't really get any more specific than that at this time. But, the funny thing about this debate, actually, in some ways, you and I are far apart from all three of those men, in the sense that they really operate in the framework of liberal and conservative. That's really as far as, in the views of Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson, and Douglas Murray, that's really as far as the legitimate political spectrum goes. And, maybe you could even touch on, if you wanted to, the fact that they were arguing against open borders. And I know you told me recently that you are actually now in favor of open borders. So I guess I just want to make the general point that, I just disagree with those people who think that. I think that narrow conception of politics, liberal, conservative, I just think that's old-fashioned. I think that has not got us anywhere. I think there are issues that humanity as a whole and each individual country will be dealing with that it needs a new way to talk about these things. And it's not just a matter of, a bigger state versus a smaller state, or well, maybe that's a bad example, but it's not about these just left-right dichotomies anymore. And I suspect that's one reason you and I get along so well, in a way. And then, I guess I would just say that since I do consider myself a radical leftist, I don't think that, and this is the part where you'll completely disagree with me, I don't think that the far left, if you will, although I'm not the kind of far left that we've been talking about. I'm not the politically correct social justice warrior type far left. I'm a different kind. But I don't think that that ideal is dead. And I, in the more conversations we have on this podcast, I hope to tell the audience more and more about how I think about it, because I don't think, I think there are conversations you can have with the far left that are necessary, and that would help us improve the world significantly.
Yeah, so I had a few thoughts on that part of the debate. So one thing that I want to mention is I could see how that basic point that he makes could be like really set you off if you're more of a radical leftist, because it's kind of like when people give these like very basic cherry picked things to people who are like ANCAPs, when they like the most classic ANCAP thing is, well, like what would you do about the roads? Like that's like the classic meme, because it's like, yeah, because you think people can't figure out how to make roads unless government tells them to. But then the other thing that's kind of infamous, people kind of say like, well, what about Ethiopia? Because there was a while where Ethiopia was essentially, in most people's minds, had no government, but it's really so corrupt that that's its whole animal, and you can address it in a very nuanced way. So I could see why, if you're a radical leftist person, and people will go, well, what about the USSR? Then you're sitting there like, yeah, I haven't thought about it. You're right. You're smarter than me. I never considered all these things that you guys talk about all the time. Now, with that said, like I was listening to a podcast. It was Thaddeus Russell getting interviewed by Pete Quinones on the Free Man Beyond the Wall podcast. So if to remind you, Matt, that Pete Quinones is the guy who made the monopoly on violence, and I think Thaddeus Russell's in it for like a couple minutes. So I was listening to them talk, and one thing that Thaddeus Russell kind of said that he's willing to, he's like a guy who came to being an anarchist, more right leaning, but he came from the far left. And one thing that he always had trouble with is thinking, okay, so we have this workers' revolution, and then what? Well, he's kind of like a guy who would goof around in school, and he's like, well, I don't want to do that work. I don't want to go to your planning meetings. I'm going to sit around. Tell me what you guys would do with me if I'm just going to sit around and not participate, because I don't want to do any of that stuff. And he's like, and I'm going to try to get other people to be lazy with me. I want friends to go to the beach with me instead of doing these obligations. So what are you going to do? Are you going to tell me that I can't get other people to go with me? Are you going to be stopping me? Are you going to be making it so I can't like associate with others? At some point, if you want them to be productive, unless every single person is compliant, you're going to run into issues, right? So that's always been one of my big obstacles with understanding how anarcho-communism could work in practice, other than voluntary communes and then letting other groups of people do what they want, right? And I think voluntary communes have a place in my anarcho-capitalist worldview. Because if you want to go join a commune in Kapistan, you're allowed to because you own the land. So you can go do a commune. But in the anarcho-communist world, you really you're making everybody be in the commune. So to some extent, though, I'm saying I think Murray's point does have to be reckoned with, even though it's not a very fruitful objection. And also, the one thing I want to say is, if he's saying how can somebody be a communist in 2020, it's like even if you're kind of trying to call them stupid, it's very easy to see why people be a communist in 2020. It's like there are clearly things wrong with our world, and there's a hint of truth in every ideology. So even though I think communism's abhorrent for a lot of reasons, and that's why I'm at ANCAP, and we've talked about that a lot, but I don't go, oh my God, how is somebody a communist? It's like I'm planning on talking about why I don't agree with Black Lives Matter in detail. But I don't sit here and think, how can anybody support that group? It's like, no, I can understand how you get to that point. It's not very complex. You do have different priors. You interpret some evidence differently, and then you don't necessarily reckon with certain obstacles that bug you. It's not that hard, and it can even be in good faith, and it could be even in a scholarly way. So yeah, I can see how that's triggering. That's my point. Do you want to chime in on that before I was gonna my next point was the borders. If you want to talk,
no, we can definitely we can move on to the borders, and then I kind of have another point I'd like to make as well.
Okay, great. Yeah, because I only have one more point after the borders, and it's actually a really small point. So I kind of liked when they talked about borders, even though obviously Harris-Peterson and Murray would not agree with me on borders, but it's because I conceptualize it differently. And I took away one part of their conversation about borders in a way that made me feel validated. And it's when Peterson kind of talks about, well, you have your nation's borders, but you also have the border around your house, and you have the border around your room, and you have the border of your body, and so forth, right? So he's pretty much saying, well, our whole life is borders, everything we've existed is borders, and at this place, this is a perfect callback to our earlier conversation point when I mentioned how Adam and Eve could be the most true things, because I think Jordan Peterson specifically says Adam and Eve, and then says the first thing they did is they put on clothes and covered themselves up because they understand that border, right? So I like that way of conceptualizing borders because that's why I think borders are important, but I don't think national borders are important because I think the state is, well, I don't think public property should exist for reasons that have to do with me having complete disfavor towards the state and believing everything they touch pretty much turns to garbage. It's like they have the inverted Midas touch. So I don't think there should be public property. And if you don't have public property, you don't have national borders. You have private borders. I have no obligation to let refugees on my property, but if my neighbor wants to house a refugee, they can. And then if Best Buy doesn't want a refugee to go into their store because they're afraid of certain types of people committing crimes, Best Buy can do whatever they want, and everybody can operate in certain ways, right? You don't have any obligation as an individual. But once we have private property, this whole can of worms gets open where Douglas Murray can go up there and talk about how we should obviously have closed borders to protect our culture. So once you get these collectivist notions that need to be protected and you have public property in the mix, you can make all these cases for infringing on people's individual rights and property rights, because now I can't bring in a friend that's in a different country to where I live unless I go through the state first, right? So I think I touched on a lot of things there related to borders. So your thoughts?
I mean, I don't have a whole lot of thoughts on borders. I guess I would just say that you and I both believe in the end of the nation state, and you can't really have a nation state without borders. So I'm against borders in that sense.
And one of the things about that, just to add on, and then you can move on, is one of the most common arguments I hear from people who are in favor of a very small state is you have a state to protect your rights, but if borders are endemic to a state, then having a state inherently infringes on your rights to have people over at your property unless they also happen to be citizens of the country, right? Or of whatever state you live in. So it's like, yeah, we need a state to protect our rights, but you don't actually have property rights because you can't really have anybody over, or you can't have anybody work for your company. You have to file all this paperwork first and we have to approve it. And it's like, oh, I thought you guys were supposed to protect our rights, but your existence inherently infringes on a bunch of things. That's all. I'm fired up about hating the state right now. Okay.
Well, I guess I would just add that. I had a thought and now I don't remember it. Well, I'll move on to the next point and maybe it'll come back to me. So this is another topic that I wanted to. Oh, I'm sorry. I remember my point now. Another issue you could have with open borders, it goes back to globalization. Another thing that a lot of Marxists or people who call themselves Marxists don't understand is Marx was very pro-globalization, and whereas a lot of people who are on the politically correct far left seem to be anti-globalization and advocating for some a time pre-agrarian a time where the farmer is like the head of the household and it seems like in some sense almost some people who are far left are also very conservative, strangely enough. But anyway, I'll move on to the other point. I wanted to talk about the criticism I wanted to talk about that some people seem to believe, and all three men brought this up themselves, that Jordan Peterson, Sam Harris, and Douglas Murray are gateway drug to the alt-right. I don't, and they steel man the people's argument. So they were trying to be respectful or they were trying to treat the argument with care, even though they vehemently disagree with it, of course. And I also vehemently disagree with it. I don't have to be the biggest fan of any of the three men to not say, or to say that they're not alt-right, because I don't think they're alt-right. The alt-right is a very small, it's a very really uninfluential group of people. Off the top of my head, I really can't even think of anybody I can think of that might be on the alt-right. Maybe Richard Spencer or someone like that, perhaps. But no one in the mainstream is in the alt-right. The mainstream media is the mainstream media attacks the alt-right at any opportunity, and I also attack the alt-right at any opportunity. I think the alt-right is a crazy group of people. But just because someone believes in open border, just because someone doesn't believe in open borders, just because someone is critical of the use of pronouns, being mandated, or just because someone is critical of Islam, and just because someone's conservative, doesn't mean that they're alt-right. And I think it's a cheap shot. I think it's people who don't know how to deal with the arguments of these three men, so they just say, they put them in a box. Alt-right, I don't have to deal with you anymore. You're an alt-right monster, garbage human being, go away. But that's dishonest. That is ridiculous. And if anybody thinks that these three men are alt-right, I will happily defend all three of them.
Yeah, I think it has to do with if anybody is bordering on a certain set of thoughts that aren't okay, which you could say like overt nationalism to an extreme extent is not good, right? So if we agreed that like that kind of thought was very dangerous, then you could think, well, maybe Douglas Murray, who's towing that line, well, maybe he's secretly on that team and he's towing the line to try to get people to take the intermediary step. But it's pretty much an excuse to anybody who's kind of maybe close to some sort of line on some issue. You throw them away. And obviously that's not reckoning with their ideas. And even if they were saying something objectionable, then you should counter the ideas. You shouldn't just ignore them. So I think we're totally on the same page there. I think that's all we have for the debate, right? Are you good on that? Okay, so that was the third one. We might wait a bit before we cover the fourth one. But now I think we're going to take a minute and we're going to cover. I think first we're going to talk about Black Lives Matter for a little bit. We got a little bit of time, and then we will I don't think we're going to have the chance to touch on coronavirus, but we might.
Now, after we've covered the third Peterson-Harris debate, we're gonna start touching on Black Lives Matter. My friend here has, I think he said, 4 main points. I just kind of have some general thoughts. So maybe I'll be commenting a bit more on his points. But I wanted to start because I wanted to make a few things clear to you and to anyone listening. As I said, even though I consider myself a radical leftist, I am. I draw a distinction between me and someone who's, whining about, the Washington Redskins being racist because of the name, for example. I think there's a kind of radical leftist that is, they don't actually really care about the issues, it seems. They just focus on, certain fringe ideas and they feel like they're sticking it to the man and that they feel like they're really radical when really they're just kind of being silly and immature. So I wanted to get that out of the way.
Wait, can I make one comment on that real quick though?
Okay.
I do want to. And I guess that relates to the Jordan Peterson thing a little bit. It does seem like there is some conflating on the right with people who are actual radicals and people who are just touching on cultural flashpoints in ways that are kind of like unnecessary or obscene. And yeah, so I think I wanted to square away that even though you say you're on the far left, like you're obviously not a person whose like top issue is statues, right?
Yes, exactly.
And it's because, and I don't think those things are unimportant though. Because they're important in the sense that the average person does engage with those things, which for better or worse, the culture war stuff, even though it seems very dumb, it's like it's all over the place and people have opinions and it's touchy. Because if you bring it up to a random person, they might get mad at you all of a sudden. So, but yeah, I agree. On an intellectual level, it's kind of trendy, right? It's not real radical leftist politics. It's not talking about actual Marxism. It's just people being, propagandized towards and then acting in crazy ways, right?
And this sort of connects, I guess you could say, to Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter is a interesting organization. I would say most of the people in that movement are not bad people. I would say most of the ideas that they fight for, I agree with. I disagree with people, who say all cops are bastards. Excuse my language. I disagree with people who, don't care about the lives of policemen, because policemen are human beings too. So there's a certain faction of Black Lives Matter that I think it is that you could say is a that politically correct social justice warrior kind of left wing, and I repudiate that faction of the Black Lives Matter movement. I would not say that is the entire organization, or that the entire organization can be just wiped, can be dismissed because of those people. We have to make sure for those of us who do think that there's some truth to the movement, or that there's some substantial points of that the movement's making substantial points. We have to make sure that the politically correct leftists don't overtake the movement, because if they do overtake the movement, then it is going to be a sinking ship. Then it is going to be a bunch of people who, it's going to be about the culture war. I mean, you can say that. I mean, I think the culture war is important in its own right, but I think if you only focus on the culture war and don't focus on some other bigger issues, then I think you're really missing the point, and you're not really truly engaged in politics. You're just, you kind of you think you're engaged, but you're not really engaged, and that's really my problem with a lot of these so-called radical leftists. They don't really know. I mean, many of them haven't even read the originals. Like, how many of them have really read Marx, for example? How many of them really know what it means to be anti-capitalist? They just kind of put on this label and like walk around the street. I'm anti-capitalist. I'm anti-capitalist. And it's like, okay, what are you gonna do about that? Are you just gonna tear down statues and just say, oh, all cops are bad? It's like, you're not doing anything. You're just, I guess you're probably just kind of stroking your own ego. You're just kind of trying to make yourself feel better. Like, well, at least I did my part. I tear down this statue today, and therefore the world's a better place. It's like, well, no, it's not. And I repudiate anybody who thinks that way.
Yeah, so I think what you said, although I'm going to say things that don't parallel it, I think that that's a good springboard into a lot of my thoughts. Now, I think we're almost inverse. We almost have inverse positions and I use that word intentionally because I think our positions mirror each other in a way, even though neither of us really are fully with it or fully against it, right? So I think what you're kind of saying is you agree with the movement, but not for the reasons they necessarily hold their positions, I guess. So you agree with a lot of what they say, but not for really the reasons they'd say. And I think I'm the opposite, where I disagree with almost everything. And the things I do agree with on, I'm the same, where I agree with them on very narrow things, but they're not the ones you agree with them on. And it's for all the wrong reasons, right? So I kind of feel like I'm sitting here, and it's like a 3-part math problem. And I made the test because obviously I'm always right. I'm the teacher here. So obviously I made the test. There's 3 questions. And they get the first 2 completely wrong. And the third question, they put the right answer, but all their work is completely wrong, and they accidentally lucked into the right answer. That's how I feel like my analysis on this movement is. Because you start from an inciting incident, which the recent cause of the protests, right? The inciting incident was George Floyd is attacked by a cop, is treated horribly by a cop and dies, and everybody agrees that police brutality is bad, and everybody would stand with anybody to say police brutality has no place in our society. We all hate police brutality. I think that goes without saying. Now, one of the reasons why this kind of bugs me as an inciting incident is this one anecdote doesn't really change what's been happening in the world. Like, there wasn't something that actually changed. It was just one event happened, and then for a month, all the big cities in the United States decided to have protests and riots, which I just find completely ridiculous because the facts on the ground hadn't changed. If you agreed with Black Lives Matter, like, the reasons for why you should agree with them shouldn't have changed from one moment to the next based on one anecdote in one city, but they did. And I think that shows the lack of depth in the political discourse in the United States. And that plays into kind of my lack of faith in democracy, because a ton of people in a ton of different areas all across a span of thousands of miles went and rioted because one event, one anecdote that's terrible happened, and people used it to push an agenda about race. That kind of bugs me because the facts hadn't changed. One event happens, everybody's out there. And it kind of shows the lack of, I guess, awareness on issues, because if people were aware of issues, then people should have been rioting before George Floyd died. But people react to viral videos. And I think that's a problem with the human nature. That one striking thing could say, well, now my whole worldview has changed because one thing happened in one city. Like, that's kind of ridiculous. And I think that's an issue. But to tackle the specific, yeah. Because I was going to go into a more broad rant. I didn't even plan on going on that rant, but I did anyways. So I'll let you chime in.
Well, I guess I do disagree with your analysis in this sense. I think the death of George Floyd was the straw that broke the camel's back. I think that many people, you could say particularly the Black community, when it comes to policing, that they have been the whole world has been struggling at one point or another due to coronavirus and the downturn in the economy. People have, had it with everything that's going on. They've had it with the government's incompetence. And I think they feel like, well, we don't have any choice. They don't listen to us, so we're going to take to the streets. Now, I think it should go without saying that you and I are against the rioting and the rioting, just because. I mean, I won't put words in your mouth, but I'm against it just because I think it's ineffective. I think you would agree with me on that. It's like it's really poor people hurting poor people. That's the way I'm kind of conceptualizing it. But I think the anger is justified. The whole society is, we're skating on thin ice, and there's a lot needs to change. And so I don't think we should throw the baby out with the bathwater. I want to acknowledge the legitimacy of the anger and the frustration and the resentment about the way our country and the world is going, even if some of the tactics or some of the people involved aren't behaving in good faith.
Okay, yeah. So I do want to move past that point because that wasn't kind of like the core of my thoughts. But I guess the last thing I'll say is I'm not saying their feelings aren't justified. I guess the fact that one viral video of one incident could change popular opinion so much so quickly seems to show how easily influenced people can be, right? And
no, I don't think it changed popular opinion. I don't think it was that video though.
If you look at public opinion polls though, right? Public opinion polls definitely moved because corporations jumped on it and it became the default opinion. That's why everybody's okay and thinks all football players should kneel now and didn't think so, 2 years ago, because it's now it's hit the capacity it needs. It hit the terminal velocity to now be acceptable, because a viral video swayed enough people to all of a sudden care more about the issue.
Well, we don't have to go on and on about that issue, but yeah, I definitely don't agree.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. We won't go on that then because it's not, I guess, as substantive as other things I want to cover. So to talk about where I narrowly agree with them and why I'm annoyed though, because I feel like they don't even have the right reasons, is because I think, as you could predict, I don't like cops at all. I think all cops are bastards, but I think it's almost definitional, right? Where I think that all cops are terrible because they're the arms of the state. They are willingly and voluntarily the arms of the state. And I think the state wants to enforce laws that are unethical on the people. So even if a cop is a nice person and he tries to be compassionate in his job and he's well-intentioned, it's like, yeah, but you're the arm of the state. Now, I don't think that cop deserves to get murdered or anything, obviously. But I think I think that's somewhat a questionable ethical choice because of my view of the actions of the state, right? So I think in their mind, they're a good person and that's okay. And in my mind, I think all cops are kind of inherently flawed because they're willing to enforce things that are immoral. Now, of course, Black Lives Matter thinks, cops are generally on average actual bad people who are willing to do bad things to individuals. And they kind of think that this is endemic to being a police officer. And I think there is some evidence for that. And I think there's a lot of evidence against that. And I think what happens is you're going to end up making a generalization no matter what. And you're not really making a well-informed point. It's mostly going to be emotional and either based on your anecdotal experiences or a few narrowly curated events that have happened over the course of a decade, right? So it's like, oh, you can name 7 of these unjust things off the top of your head, but that's 7 things over like 7 years. How many incidents happened that are without problem? So I don't agree with, I agree with their contention, but I don't agree for the same reasons. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, okay, so I guess I feel, the ACAB, I just kind of think that's empty rhetoric. I really don't think that does anything. So that's really, I guess, if we have any disagreement about that, that's really all it is. But I guess I would like to say a few things. I am not really what you would say. I don't really come to the defense of the cops very often. I don't agree. I think the police force across the country is inherently flawed. In some ways, cops in general, you could say the whole institution globally is inherently flawed. I think some countries do it better than others. That doesn't mean I'm necessarily pro. That doesn't mean I'm pro having cops in the way we have them now. But you can have good or bad ways to implement that kind of system. And I guess that kind of brings up another general point, which I want to talk about. Another piece, you could call it a piece of rhetoric, but there is a point to it. Defund the police. And I guess what I want to say is I think it's easy for most people to hear that and just dismiss it outright. They say, "Oh, defund the police. Well, what's going to happen if I get mugged and there's no policeman nearby?" So, obviously, we can't defund the police. But that's not exactly what that means necessarily. Now, some people might say that, but I don't think, generally speaking, that's what that means. I think that there's really two kind of positions you could have on that make the most sense to me. Either you have a reduced police force until there is implementation of reforms, or you have no police at all. And I only say that last part in the sense that it is possible, and I'm not saying I agree with this necessarily, but it's possible to make the argument that, well, is it better to have a police force that actively works against you, or is it better to have no police force at all? So, I think, as I say, if we're going to have police, they need to be completely okay. I guess what I'm trying to say is this. Maybe the concept itself is not necessarily a bad thing. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is the idea of having a trained group of people that keeps the peace and can solve disputes and can help people either prevent atrocious things from happening or rush to the aid of the victims when these atrocious things do happen. I have nothing against that idea in theory, and I think you could probably come up with a similar type of position or something that's similar to the police but is not exactly police in the way we conceptualize it now. But I think the way we conceptualize police now is it does more harm than good, and often it does more harm towards those who are more disenfranchised. It does more harm towards people in poverty. It does more harm towards the minorities. So yeah,
you won't hear me defending police at all. I mean, obviously we both have different opinions on the police, but we have a kind of generally a similar conclusion. Now, I always run into the issue of the police are enforcing the laws, and they're not the ones who write the laws. And then I run into the other problem of, but polices aren't autonomous drones, so they have some level of enforcing things how they want to, right? So. So what happens with every police misconduct story I hear about is like I'm forgetting the name of the very famous guy who was selling Lucy's and then is put in a chokehold, and then he later dies because he was a very large, not in shape guy who had a bunch of physical exertion on him, including a chokehold, and then he later ends up dying, right? So that's terrible, and some people can read that as police abuse, but you can also read it as some people have the job of, to defending the laws of the state, and the laws of the state says you can't sell things unless it's a transaction approved by the state, because how else would the state get its money? And he goes out there and is selling loose cigarettes, and then what the state does is they enforce their laws about sales. So you can read that story as, oh, those cops handled that poorly, or you can read that story as, wow, the state's like, the whole amalgamation of the state is evil. Now, what's going to happen is, I think the state makes the life harder for everybody, but the people who bear the biggest brunt of it are generally poor people, because if something screws over a poor person, they don't have a ton of, or they don't have a lot of resources to get around it. So, and also since the state creates inefficiencies, it gives you an incentive to work around it for a profit. So if you're in a bad situation, if you're an ex-con, if you're an ex-convict, and the state makes it hard for you to get a job because they put you in a cage 5 years ago, and then you're thinking, well, I can at least make a few extra bucks selling cigarettes right here, and nobody will generally do anything about it. Then when the state randomly shows up and decides to enforce it, they kill you, right? And that wouldn't happen to rich people, because rich people are never in the situation where they're trying to make a quick buck. So what ends up happening is Black Lives Matter interprets this scene that happens as, look at these cops treating a black man terribly and using unnecessary force on him. And I read it as like, well, yeah, the state generally hurts everything it touches, and the state has put its roots deeply into so many things, and one of them is selling cigarettes. And of course they're gonna attack people who disrupt their revenue chain, and of course they're gonna sick cops on them, because that's how the state enforces anything. So I see them as synonymous issues, but I guess one of my main problems with Black Lives Matter is they only care about the cops part. That's the thing they talk about. I mean, okay, no, I'm going to walk that back 2 steps, because one of my more important points is how Black Lives Matter broadens their agenda out so much that it's problematic. But one thing is, when they mostly talk about cops being the issue, you miss that whole part. Now, I guess this can flow into my other point. My other point is, I hate that they're named Black Lives Matter, because it implies that if I disagree with them, I disagree with the phrase Black Lives Matter, which it's just a loaded phrase and it puts you in a terrible position. And it was joked on a different podcast I heard, where they were saying the Republicans should call themselves the Don't Kill Puppies Party. And then if you say you're in favor of raising taxes, then you must be in favor of killing puppies, right? Because that's against what the platform of the Don't Kill Puppies Party is. That's how I feel like when I have to point out problems with Black Lives Matter, is I feel like if I say something like, wow, I don't agree with Black Lives Matter, because on their website, I wrote this down earlier, on their website, it says that they're in favor of rectifying environmental injustice, economic injustice. It says people need access to healthcare, and it said they're proponents of LGBTQIA plus issues, right? So if I'm sitting here and I oppose any of those things, since the group's called Black Lives Matter, the implication can be, you don't agree with Black Lives Matter, even though I'm trying to talk about why I think the state has harmed people in an economic way. So I don't agree with using the state to try to rectify those things. But then that can put me in a spot because of their name. And I have a problem with that. And they're trying to tie all these issues together that are in some ways related, in some ways unrelated. And in some ways, I think they're contradicting themselves. So I have a problem with all of that. So yeah, I spit that out there. I just vomited a bunch of opinions that are loosely interconnected, if you want to chime in on anything.
I would say I don't think you're quite grappling with the history of the United States and the history of Europe as a whole, because I mean, I don't really, in some sense, I don't really care one way or the other what the name of the movement is, but I can see why they call themselves Black Lives Matter. It's because, historically speaking, Black lives did not matter. And historically speaking, if you were African American, you were property. You did not even have, not until I guess the end of the Civil War, 1865, maybe a couple years after that, the 13th Amendment was passed and whatnot. So it took time to it took time to for the Black people, for African Americans to establish themselves as a equal participant in society. And then even after the Civil War, there was Jim Crow laws, the KKK increased in size and scope. I'm not saying they're almost done. I'm not saying there's well, that's a small point. I'm not saying that there's a lot of KKK membership nowadays, but I'm just making the point that that they have not that statement has not been obvious for most of our history, and it's not even just American history. I mean, the Europeans were the ones that brought slaves over here in the first place. And Thomas Jefferson, in a interesting historical fact, if you want to know, I think it was in his first draft of the Declaration of Independence, he argued that Britain had perpetuated the slave trade by bringing it over to the colonies. So, I think we disagree on the importance of that, perhaps.
Yeah, so everything you said is like very crucial, and I'm glad you brought it up, and I'm glad you formulated it in that way, that name. Everything you just said is why I think their name is so pernicious. Like, I think that's why it's such a problem that's their name. Because they're taking that name, which is a great point, and it's a great thing to argue, and it's a great thing to bring up, and then they're attaching things to it that are unrelated, right? So it's almost like I don't know. I don't think they're doing it intentionally, because I don't like applying. I don't want to assign malice where malice isn't due, and I don't want to accuse them of using that as a political bludgeon. But it is kind of perfect to make that point, which is a completely valid, rational point, and say we want to reiterate that is our goal, and then broaden their horizons out to LGBTQ issues. And it's like you're saying Black Lives Matter because it's not something we should take for granted historically. But then you're saying, yeah, Black Lives Matters, they stand for gay and transgender rights. And it's like, well, now you can't critique them on their nuances and positions they take, because you can seem like I'm arguing against that history when I'm not, right? So if they're going to broaden out to all these other topics, then their name shouldn't be Black Lives Matter, because it's not about that anymore. They're arguing about the environment, right? And then they can try to use identitarianism to tie it together, I guess, if they so choose to. But that's not really what they're doing. It's really just a very broad left of center group calling themselves Black Lives Matter and adopting a whole agenda. And that's why if you've seen some of the protests, some of them are very much only about these traditionally like Black Lives Matter type causes. But some people will have signs that are like pro-trans rights, and like everybody's cool with it because that's also what they're about. But that being the name, and then that being the history, kind of puts it in conflict if you want to push back on anything that's separate from the Black Lives Matter issue, right? Did you get why I find such a problem with that?
I understand. I don't really have much more to say on it, though. Could I veer off into another general point about something connected to Black Lives Matter? I just have to really think more about what you said. I don't really have opinions. I don't really agree or disagree with it in some sense. But I was watching a clip of the I forget the exact show name, but it was with The Hill. And then I was also been listening to some more, liberal commentators. Since I'm a recovering liberal. And this whole thing with Black Lives Matter and the protests and the rioting, and the upcoming 2020 election has me. I think I've changed my position slightly, and I kind of like to elaborate a little bit as to why I've changed my opinion, and I'll try to connect it to Black Lives Matter itself. I think it was, I don't remember, a couple podcasts ago, I was saying, I'm not going to vote for Joe Biden. I don't like Joe Biden. My vote in Kentucky really doesn't matter. If I vote for Joe Biden in Kentucky, that really doesn't have any sway in what's going on. And I still don't like Joe Biden. I still think he's a terrible candidate. I will be as critical of him as anybody if he were to get elected. But I'm no longer saying that I won't vote for him. I'm still slightly conflicted about it, but I'm leaning towards voting for him, which is, it's that goes against what I said previously. And I think that partly has to do with the situation going on here and the president's response. So, what did the president do during all these riotings and these riots and these protests and all the looting and whatnot? He literally sent in American the armed forces to deal with the problem. And I didn't fully comprehend the meaning of that action until I started listening to some people's commentary on it, and I started to think about a little bit more about it myself. But that to me crosses a line. You're not supposed to use the armed forces against American civilians. I mean, I don't think you should use them overseas. You shouldn't be dropping bombs overseas either. But he broke, like he didn't even pay lip service to the idea that, well, we're a free democratic society, so we're going to deal with these things in a different way. It's like, nope, send in the military automatically. Now he, due to the backlash, he got the military out of the cities, out of the way, and they're no longer the military are no longer deployed. But again, I think that is so far beyond what he should have done. And if I thought to myself, as much as I don't like, say, Joe Biden or even Barack Obama, would they have responded in the same way? No, I don't think so. And then I would make one more general point, which is, I think Biden has shown that he is not, even though he's a neoliberal corporatist, he does seem to be listening to a lot of these protesters, and he still, puts his foot in his mouth, like when he says, if you don't vote for me, you're not black and whatever. I mean, I still don't like him, but I think he's showing signs of progress. I think he's showing signs of moving in the right direction, and being responsive to the Bernie Sanders AOC wing of the Democratic Party. So I would feel, again, if I were to vote for him and he gets in office, the day he's in office, I'm going to be criticizing him like as hard as I would criticize anyone else. But I'm far more willing to give him my vote now under these current circumstances than I was several weeks or a month or so ago.
Yeah. Okay. I don't. Your broad points there, your more general points, I don't have any huge disagreements with. I guess I just want to run through like a few comments I just have. One thing you mentioned about how Trump wouldn't pay lip service to certain democratic values. I think that's actually a good bug that Trump has, is because he's incapable of playing the traditional politician role. He doesn't dress things up nicely. He just kind of does it. And if you had somebody who was more likely to be a traditional politician but had the same impulses, people wouldn't be as outraged when he does things that are outrageous. And I think that's a good thing. So I think that's a pro, even though it's like, obviously it sends the wrong signal and it could be upsetting, but it's like, well, I'd rather that than somebody lying to me.
I was just making the point. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I'm just making, when I said that, I was just making the general point that
you're just observing. Yeah.
I would feel, we could have a slightly different conversation if he was still paying lip service to it. I mean, I was just observing. But yeah, it's not even, so he's not even like Hillary Clinton, who, I mean, I don't even know, she probably wouldn't even done that either. But supposing, Donald Trump did that, but he was like paying the lip service that we're not going to solve problems this way, we would be having almost slightly different conversation. But no, he was proudly using the military against American civilians, and that's what I have a problem with.
Yeah. And I obviously I agree that that's a problem. Although I guess the only reason why I'm not enthusiastically, I guess, on board with the sentiment of what you're saying. So like I literally agree, but the reason why the sentiment of it I'm not in agreement as much is that this isn't. I don't find this uniquely outrageous. I don't find it like any worse than all the things that the state does that bugs me, right? So like I think taxation existing is still like a million times worse than that. So I'm not. I'm like so indifferent. I'm like, yeah, that sounds pretty bad. I believe it. But it's like I would rank that like number 200 on my priorities. And it's like in certain situations it could be so much worse, right? But I don't know. Obviously it's bad. Obviously I agree. I just like I guess I'm not that surprised by it. I'm not that outraged by it because everything they do disgusts me. So it's like yes, another disgusting thing. Okay. But yeah. The other point I was going to make was I think this shows how even though we both kind of consider ourselves radicals in our own rights, we still operate on two very different planes when it comes to participating in voting. Because now I'm more resonating with the Michael Malice and Thaddeus Russell idea, where like when I was listening to Thad today, he said something about how he's not an American citizen. It's just he technically is because the state deemed him one, but he doesn't identify with that way of thinking because he's like I'm not really here. Right. I don't really value what you have to say. I don't feel like I have input. I don't want to have input. I don't want to be involved with you. I'm not really an American. I just happen to be born here. And then one thing that Michael Malice said about voting is he says he doesn't vote for the same reason. He doesn't like care who the Pope is because he doesn't go to church and he's not religious. Right. So that's his view of the president. So it's kind of like, yeah, I'm not gonna select who's my leader because I don't want an overlord. And I'm not willing to engage in the practice of picking an overlord because I resent having an overlord, and there shouldn't be one. So I could tell as you're saying that, like everything you said made sense, but I was just acutely aware of how we're on opposite planes, right? Yeah, and I don't really want to have a discussion about why we're at different planes. That's not the point. I'm just saying I was like very aware of like, oh yeah, you're thinking about your vote and the ways to participate in the process, and I'm thinking of ways that I can I think about ways to nullify the process or my participation in it or ways to secede from it. I'm not thinking about how I can engage more. I'm thinking about ways to disengage, right? So we're on like different spheres there. So I know it's tangentially related to what you said. It's not literally, but sometimes my thoughts are kind of 3 layers different.
And one thing I also wanted to add was, if there are any radical leftists listening, they might accuse me of being a reformist, someone who, wants to gradually change the system and doesn't want any maybe radical change. And I just want to make it clear, I'm not a reformist. That's really what liberals are, people who are trying to make gradual changes to a system. I'm no longer a liberal. I repudiate that. But that doesn't mean that, and this goes back to your point, we conceptualize the system differently. I still participate in the system. I just voted in the Democratic primary not too long ago, or sent in my mail-in vote. Shout out to Cory Booker of Kentucky, by the way. But that doesn't make me a reformist, and that doesn't mean I don't think we need radical change. It just means I still see some value in participating in the system, and I still think that you can believe in radical change and still fight for little change. Those aren't mutually exclusive. I mean, you're just fighting on 2 fronts in some sense. That's how I feel myself to be fighting on. There really isn't a political party that a radical leftist political party in the United States. Maybe the Green Party is the closest thing, but they don't really have any power. So as I might have said before, I kind of see myself fighting on 2 fronts. There's the part of me that's much more strategic and much more politically savvy and much more willing to make compromises and work within that system itself. And then there's the part of me that's trying to fight for a different system. And I just disagree with anyone who thinks those are necessarily mutually exclusive. I just think they're 2 sides of the same coin. They're just 2 modes of my thought process, modes of my life and my personality that I think are necessary in the world that we live in.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think those things are mutually exclusive. I think I think we're in line on that. Like when the government decides to lower taxes, right? I'm not like pissed, and it's like, oh cool, I get 2% more than I did last year. Like I'm okay with that. I just kind of am trying to dedicate less headspace to kind of groveling for you know, I don't know. I've gotten to the point where compromising feels like I'm groveling at the feet of my overlords because my end goal is for them to not be my overlords. But until they aren't my ruler, I have to ask them, can you guys please stop doing this? Or can more people agree that we can change this? And I don't know. I'm disheartened by that even conceptually. But I agree. You can be you can be doing both things at the same time. That's obviously true, and a lot of people say it's not. And you're right.
And you even said, this might be a slight irrelevant point, but I'm going to say it anyway. You even said in the last episode, in our anarcho-capitalist episode, you said you don't really have a plan to get to your ideal future. So, I mean, in some ways, I mean,
Well,
I guess here's the way I would kind of conceptualize it or put it. I mean, we live in a society, to quote the Joker, and we all kind of go along to get along to some extent, even if we radically disagree with the system. I mean, I still, pay my taxes, even though I know my tax money is going to bombing innocent civilians in the Middle East. And in some ways I feel awful about that and I feel responsible for that, but I still pay my taxes. You see what I'm saying?
yeah. I mean, I think the reason why I don't know the middle steps though is because I kind of have given up on being the reformist and being the ones making like the incremental arguments. And I know there are academics doing it. And as you said that, like I've been going through, I subscribed to Reason Magazine because they had like a deal. And I was like looking through their backlog, and then I've also been digging through old archives of like the Ludwig von Mises Foundation papers, and there's like a bunch of Rothbard stuff all about the process of desocializing and to get to all private property. So I'm like, somebody's done that work. If I want to make that argument, I could read a paper and then I could recite that argument. But I'm just like, that's not in my interest right now. If I can't even convince people that freedom is a worthy thing, then what's the point of desocializing if the argument's always going to be how can we socialize the next thing? So it's like I'm not gonna worry about that for now. But we've gone way over on time, and which is good because we were kind of worried we wouldn't have a lot to talk about. So that was episode 3 on Peterson Harris. I mean, it was the third Peterson Harris debate. And we did get a good discussion out of everything going on related to Black Lives Matter. And I'm glad we talked about that now, because if we tried covering it a month ago, we probably would have hedged things we said. But now that it's settled down a lot, I think we felt pretty free to give like more thought out thoughts, because a lot's been going on. So before we head off, you can find the video version where you can see my co-host has a fresh new haircut, and I'm still sitting here with a ridiculous overgrown, now I'm the one with the crazy hair. But hopefully by next episode, I'll have it cut. We should be opening up soon. And so you can find our video version if you go on YouTube, type in the anti-philosopher and then like Beyond Talking Points. You should be able to find any of the video versions. And as always, you can listen to us on any podcatcher like Spotify or Apple Podcasts and so forth. So did you want to add anything before I sign off? Nope. Okay. Sounds great. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We appreciate it. Feel free to share or spread it. And that we're going to be back every week with more content and more arguing and more going on about radical philosophies that are a little bit out of the norm. Or as you could say beyond talking points. Signing off, it's Matt and Matt.